Something to watch for. And then, as you say, the icing on the cake, the fly pass. 2 different segments coming up in the next hour or 2. So walk us through what happens with that.
Yeah, so if you are an aircraft buff or you care about military aircraft, this is the place to be downtown Toronto, because in the next couple of hours, we're going to see some historic aircraft that maybe your parents or grandparents, or if you're lucky enough, you yourself might have flown during one of Canada's vintage eras. So there's 4 vintage aircraft that we're going to see. They include the B-25 Mitchell Mk3, the Douglas DC-3 Dakota, which is another aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, and the FG-1D Corsair. A couple of hours later, we will see the modern fleet of the Canadian Air Force fly overhead, including the CF Hornets. These are the military fighter aircraft that Canada sends into combat. We will also see the famous Snowbirds, the C-114 Tudor aircraft that will fly over downtown Toronto. And of course, all of this will be presided over by the Governor General in one of his final acts as GG, overseeing the Royal Canadian Air Force. Jennifer.
Neil, thank you for setting the stage. CBC's Neil Herland in downtown Toronto. And to help guide us through our coverage of the color change ceremony and the flyby is Jock Williams. He's no stranger to our viewers and a former fighter pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He's also participated in past color change ceremonies. So let's talk a little bit, Jock. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure, Jennifer.
Hey, by the way, this is an historic day for you too.
It is. It is.
This is the day you got your wings.
50 years ago today, I got my wings in the Air Force and became eventually a fighter pilot.
Well, that's wonderful timing. I'm glad you're here. So let's start by talking a bit about the significance, as you see it, of this kind of a color change ceremony.
Well, the colors are the, how can I say, the lifeblood of any given unit in the military. Of course, it started with Army regiments. Army regiments marched into battle with their colors. And their orders were, if in doubt, if the battle's looking bad, rally around the colors. That's where we need you. And that applies to infantry regiments. In the artillery, they rally around the cannons, which are their colors. But all in all, this is a ceremony where the sovereign gives new colors, and then they'll march them past the troops saying, this is the one to be looking for. Ah. And then they'll be put into a suitably reverend storage situation for probably the next 20 years. We don't drag them out and march with them very much.
So 2 different colors, 2 different flags.
That's right,
so the first
Queen's
one,
color.
the Queen's color. And what does that one signify then?
Well, it's a personal gift from the Queen to the organization that's being so honored. This will be, it looks like a Canadian flag, but it'll have another crest in the center of it. But the Queen's color is always the national flag. And then the command color will be Air Force blue with a suitable Air Force crest in it, you know, per ardua, ad astra, and so on, written on it. But the 2 of them together are the colors of the unit.
So lots to watch for. Thanks for setting the stage. We are going to ask you to stand by as we wait for events to unfold live in Toronto, and we'll be chatting with you much more when it takes place, and we'll bring it all to our viewers live. So that's a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot, Jock Williams, who is sticking around for the next couple of hours. Well, the skies are clear. That's the good news over Texas and Louisiana today. The future less so for the thousands affected by days of massive flooding. Many in the Houston area are returning to assess the damage wrought by Storm Harvey. Furniture and other possessions are being dragged to the curb. Not only are they waterlogged, there is concern everything's contaminated with dangerous bacteria. At least 46 Texans have died as a result of the storm. But officials say that number is likely to rise as the recovery effort continues. Now, the big numbers. It is estimated that 102 trillion liters of water fell on Texas and Louisiana over the past week. 100,000 homes have been damaged or destroyed, according to U.S. Homeland Security. As for damage estimates, they range from $75 billion to almost $200 billion U.S., making this the costliest storm in the country's history. Many of those affected by the storm live in communities just outside of Houston. The CBC's Lindsay Duncombe is in the city of Richmond. That's to the southwest. She's been talking to homeowners there about the damage.
As you drive through the suburbs of Houston, this is what you see. People who have their belongings out on their front yards, everything from electronics that are waterlogged and don't work to heaps of drywall ripped out of people's walls. The home where I'm standing here, in front of it, there are more than 40 garbage bags. What's in those garbage bags? Clothing, food, papers, all of it destroyed. And the man who owns the home told me something we have heard over and over again from people here, and that is that he does not have flood insurance. In fact, he is lying awake at night worrying about the tens of thousands of dollars he figures it's going to take in order to be able to put his life back together. And like so many others, he is hoping that FEMA and the federal government will come through with cash to help them out. There's something else that we've noticed here in Texas, though, and that is no one is in this alone. Every home we stop at, there are neighbors dropping by with water, neighbors helping haul things out of the house, neighbors looking after children or just keeping people company. This is the beginning of a long process, and clearly Texans say they're going to get through it together. Lindsay Duncombe, CBC News, Richmond, Texas.
Canadians are feeling Harvey's impact at the gas pumps. The storm has taken refineries offline all along the Gulf Coast. Couple that with increased demand on the Labor Day weekend, and gas prices could spike even more. Our Jeannie Lee is standing by with that part of the story, and we will hear from her a little later this hour. If you are in Toronto today, look to the skies. Elsewhere in the country, stay here with CBC News Network. As we've been reporting, the Royal Canadian Air Force is getting what are called their new colors today. As part of the ceremony, there will be 2 flypasts of military aircraft. That's expected to start any minute now, and we will have extensive coverage straight ahead. Stay with us. This is the scene live right now in downtown Toronto. The pomp and ceremony associated with the Royal Canadian Air Force getting their new colors. The colors are the ceremonial flags carried by armed forces units. The Air Force is replacing the ones they got back in 1982. Those have just been paraded off, and presiding over this event, Governor General David Johnston. And coming up, here they are now. So I want to bring Jock Williams, who's here beside me, as we take a look at some of this military aircraft in the sky. Okay, well, as you can see, coming towards us is a P-51 Mustang, and it looks like a B-25 Mitchell. The Mustang is the single-engine airplane. The twin is a Mitchell. The Mitchell did the famous Tokyo raid led by Jimmy Doolittle in 1942, and the Mustang was next to the Spitfire, the preeminent fighter in the Allied forces. This is a special event. We're seeing 4 military aircraft expected today at this first part. I also want to say welcome and hello right now to our friends on Facebook who are joining us and watching all of this unfold live. And we're encouraging those of you on Facebook, send in any questions you have for my guest here as well, Jock Williams, and we'll try to get to your questions too as we watch all the pomp and ceremony unfolding here. Are you the kind of guy who actually can name a plane just by listening to the sound of its engine? Sometimes. Certainly a Spitfire or a Mustang, and certainly a Harvard, and quite a few others. Not all of them, but a pretty high number. And you have flown some of these that we're seeing. I have flown all of them so far, and I think pretty much all of the ones you're going to see. The one word we have heard, the Lancaster bomber was supposed to be part of today's ceremony, but apparently we don't know. As you were telling me earlier, Lancasters can be very sensitive creatures, and we're not sure why, but yeah, sure. That's going to be replaced by a Douglas DC-3. Okay. So some of the ceremony here, as we mentioned, the Governor General is also on hand. This is expected to be, if not the last time, certainly one of the final times that he will wear the RCAF uniform as part of his role. It's the only time I've ever seen him wearing an Air Force uniform. He's been in a Navy uniform and he's been in his Governor General's, but he looks good in his Air Force uniform. He does. Yeah. He carries himself well. And so when it comes to bringing these aircraft out, this is quite an unprecedented event too, isn't it? To get all of the aircraft together like this? To have this selection, yeah, I don't think there's ever been this selection before in Canada. It's only too bad that they're going by at such a height you can barely see them. That's. We're going to see if we can actually hear some of the sights and sounds too. So we'll just pause and listen in for a minute here too. That's what we saw there, just a little nod.
Please be seated. The evening is called.
into a hollow square, which began as a defensive formation for infantry unit threatened by cavalry and continues to be used ceremonially to this day. Today's hollow square will enable all of the members on parade to witness the formal consecration of the college. Les gains sont formés en disposition rectangulaire, centre ouvert, qui a son origine comme formation défensive pour des unités d'infanterie menacées par une cavalerie et qui continue d'être utilisée cérémonialement jusqu'à maintenant. Aujourd'hui, la disposition rectangulaire.
Watching events unfolding live in Nathan Phillips Square in downtown Toronto. We've had a brief military plane fly past, and my guest in studio with me is former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot Jock Williams, and we've got friends joining us on Facebook watching along live, and some of them are sending you questions. For example, Jennifer Lynn is wondering which of the planes is referred to as the Flying Fortress.
Flying Fortress is an American Boeing B-17. There's not one in this. We did fly a few of them, primarily flying mail from Montreal Dorval to England for our soldiers, but we didn't use them in operations.
All right, we have another question here from, this is a good one, David Coleman asking, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this one, but why Toronto for this? It's been 35 years since they changed the color, and we can talk about why change the colors now too, but significance to this location?
Well, Toronto is the biggest city in the country, and many people in Toronto seem to feel it's the center of the earth besides. But generally speaking, I think they picked the place where they'd have the largest audience, and of course the International Air Show was on here, so there's an impressive number of airplanes around town anyway. All in all, I think it's fitting that it should be in Canada's biggest city. Ottawa gets altogether too much for...
Well, as you mentioned, the air show continues this week in Toronto as well. And one of our viewers on YouTube is asking if you have a favorite plane.
I do have a favorite plane. I have two. The first one is the Tiger Moth, which I own and fly, and my sons both fly it. The second one is the Supermarine Spitfire. I think every fighter pilot loves the Spitfire. Distinctive noise, beautiful lines, wonderful airplane.
The Tiger Moth you say you have, how old is that plane?
It was built in 1942, a year before me, and I've owned it since 1969. My boys and I fly it. I spent the last weekend with my one son, and I'll be spending this weekend with my other one flying it in Tilsonburg.
How wonderful. So it's in the DNA, clearly.
I think so. That's,
Why would it take 35 years, I guess, is another question, to change the colors? This is only the third time in history, really, we've had new colors like this.
They've changed some other things. This is a whole new reincarnation of the Royal Canadian Air Force. They even changed the motto. I notice it's going to be Sic Iter ad astra, such as the route to the stars. It used to be Per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars. So it's a rebirth of the Royal Canadian Air Force, and those of us who were in it when it died last time are very happy to see this. They stole our Air Force, and we're happy to get it back.
So why is this important to you today?
Well, the Air Force had a long and fine history. They had done magnificent work in World War II and in World War I, although it wasn't the Royal Canadian Air Force then. But all of a sudden, in about 1968, they shut the Air Force down and they amalgamated the Army, Navy, and Air Force with a good plan for economies of scale and so on. But to be honest, I don't believe it really worked. And many, many people were so disappointed. Some people actually quit when they shut down the RCAF and the Navy, who was very proud of its traditions and so on. So this is a rebirth and a very proud thing for people who wear the light blue. The Army's always been proud of its uniform, and they've always had either a green or a brown one, and that's appropriate. But the Navy sailors hated getting off their ships wearing this jolly green jumper. Yeah. They wanted to wear sailor suits, and they've got them back now. So.
Isn't that interesting? And you mentioned the significance of the colors today. In Toronto, Mayor John Tory has declared this Royal Canadian Air Force Day in the city. The CN Tower will be Air Force blue. The iconic signs around the city, the Toronto sign as well, turning blue today. We're talking about what's being described as a parade of aircraft, and it was very brief before the ceremony that we're seeing now. If we could just talk again, some of our Facebook friends asking to talk a little bit more about the planes we saw going overhead. There were supposed to be 4. We were told the Lancaster wasn't able to take part in today's, but walk us through again the planes that we saw in that split second flying over Nathan Phillips Square.
Well, we saw the P-51 Mustang, which was the preeminent American fighter in World War II and soldiered on into Korea. And then we saw the B-25 Mitchell, which was most famous for the famous Jimmy Doolittle raid on Tokyo in 1942. So the big one is the Mitchell and the small one is the Mustang. And they're both really iconic aircraft, there's no question. I've been lucky enough to fly both of them. And when you get into an airplane of that vintage and that fame level, I remember saying to myself, please God, don't let me crash this airplane. I'll be destroying a national resource. But they're wonderful airplanes, and flying out of the Warplane Heritage, a wonderful museum in Hamilton.
Yes. Can you describe what it's like to be in the cockpit?
Well, they're old airplanes. The instrumentation is old. You look at it and you say, boy, that's what they had in those days, because our instruments nowadays look pretty much like television sets or iPads or iPods. In those days, they were black with white numbers and letters and so on them. And, but they worked, you know, they carried out their job. But there's a certain smell to an antique airplane also. It's sort of leather and oil, and it's inspiring when you get into one of these things, when you know you're going to get a chance to fly it.
Do you ever itch to fly something like that again?
Well, I do, but I guess I've aged myself out of contention. 74, I guess, is what we consider too old to do that. But I used to fly the Lancaster and the Mitchell and the C-47. I thought there was going to be a C-47 in the fly past.
It might have just been out of our range of our camera there, so we'll get our eyes and ears on the ground to confirm that for us. And this all harkens back to the first time the RCAF got its colors. We were, in fact, the first of the Commonwealth Air Forces to be granted the privilege of carrying, at the time, the King's color. That was back in 1950, together with the RCAF color, presented in the name of King George VI back on Parliament Hill in Ottawa on the King's birthday. So that was all the way back June 5, 1950. After that, replaced, as we've mentioned, in 1982. So this is the kind of thing, partly adding to how unique and special this day is. This is not the kind of thing that happens often.
No, it probably once every 25 years for any given squadron, and that's pretty good frequency.
When we talk about the importance of the RCAF today, we talked a little bit about why this is important in terms of perhaps for someone like you and veterans, RCAF members, for Canadians watching this now, and as we go forward with the RCAF, with these new colors, what is the significance of a day like this, do you think?
Well, I think the Canadian public they've been sort of out of touch with the Canadian military for some years. And with the advent of the war in Afghanistan, many people became more aware of the Army. This is the chance for the Air Force to get a little recognition, and the Navy needs both recognition and new ships. But any attention that can be paid to the Canadian military is long overdue. We've sort of cheaped out on our treatment of those people, if you don't mind my speaking politically. It's important that we treat our armed forces with some respect and that we understand what they do and what they need. And I think this is the beginning of it. I hope it is.
A way to pause and celebrate today, too.
I hope.
Well, we've lost our live shot, I'm being told, and I should remind viewers as well that in the 2 o'clock hour, 2 o'clock Eastern, there's going to be another fly past, this time of all of the various planes that are part of the RCAF today, having passed the historical portion just moments ago. So that's something to look forward to in the next hour. And Jock, I know you'll join me for that. Some more questions on Facebook for you here. Okay. Another person asking, what is the oldest plane that you have flown?
I used to fly the Avro 504, which is the oldest airplane flying. It was then flying in Canada. It was built in 1917. I flew it for the for the War Museum in the collection in Rockcliffe. And I've also flown the Newport 17 and crashed it at an Abbotsford air show. So both those airplanes were 1917 vintage. And unfortunately, 1917 vintage airplanes don't always hold together.
I can imagine. We are going to pause there on our questions with you, Jock. And as I mentioned, we're going to see you again next hour. Thank you so much for being with us. I also want to say thank you and goodbye to our friends on Facebook who have been joining us for this special live event happening live in Toronto. As mentioned, another one coming your way in the next hour, and our top headlines also coming up here on CBC News Network. We say goodbye to those of you who've been watching us on the main network.